This is the Data Download, your guide to upping your game when it comes to managing and accessing data in your organization. For Calibra, I'm your host, Jay Millicher. Previously on the Data Download, we had an insightful conversation with the fantastic Michelle Getz about the slightly mind-blowing world of generative AI. Who knew data could be so fun, right? The topic of discussion? Harnessing the power of generative AI to make some serious magic happen in our business, while keeping the robots on a leash, of course. We've all read some stories in the recent past with generative AI producing blatantly false information. Let's call that maybe consumer grade AI. And we've been talking about businesses and organizations that have, let's say, their good data practices feeding their models. So let's get into that. Like what are some best practices to think about validating that output and really making sure that we're getting it right, that we're producing high quality results?
We need to be better at cross-referencing.
Okay.
You know, sometimes we get in the habit, we're a little lazy. Somebody gives us a report and we're like, oh my God, this is great numbers. It's telling me what I think. Of course, I'm going to use this.
Mm-hmm.
And you just go off and you use it. But the reality is if you're relying on a machine to produce that output, you want to trust that that machine was making the right decision. It's just like sometimes you're getting a report from a colleague or an analyst and you look at those numbers and you're like, no, even if I squint, that doesn't look right. You know, it's like, well, why? Because there's other types of information and experiences that you have that inform you that something's a little off, or you're going to be making a mission critical decision that has a lot of consequences. You want to make sure you have, looking at several points of light and not just one.
Right.
So there's a literacy in how you make decisions using outputs from any analytic competency, more so with generative AI outputs. So that's one side of it. But the other side is, how can generative AI help us to produce transparency in a generative AI capability?
Okay.
And I think that that's really at the heart of it, because when the outputs come around a summarization of content or a pattern that was seen in the way that maybe healthcare was provided, you're able to say, well, why were you suggesting that? Where is the summary coming from? The references back to that content. So you can click on that content directly and see, what did it actually say? Now, that's also part of the training process, but it's also part of the trust process and the solution. And since it's self-learning somewhat, the way that you are also continuously testing against what those outputs are and whether you're going to accept them or whether you're going to reject them is going to strengthen the model itself.
Yeah.
So it's that two-sided space of really understanding how you should trust or not trust. And if that's the case, what are your tools? But at the same time, how do you use generative AI to create transparency in itself?
In the first place, yeah, exactly. That's a really interesting use case itself, and a simple way to approach that credibility factor on the output is old school footnoting, right?
It is. It's old school footnoting.
Show me your sources for whatever it is that you're generating this output, and as long as that's included, people can refer to it and do their own validating.
That's right.
That's pretty neat. What's old is new. Companies aren't going to get all this right in the beginning. There's a lot of hype right now. Lots of us are experimenting, creating new products already in the market. There's all sorts of stuff coming out every single day, all day. When we're in phases like that, governments often want to start thinking about not stopping, but regulating how these things are done so that all of this is done safely, right? I think governments want innovation, but they want it safely so that it's not exploiting, excluding, harming their constituents, right? People. So what kinds of regulations are coming? How soon? What should we be thinking about and preparing for?
Yeah.
How can we, as AI practitioners in our organizations, start getting ahead of that so that we can safely innovate and produce great stuff that, provides value without harm?
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly, the biggest piece of legislation is the AI Act in the EU.
Uh-huh.
And they're being very proactive in reaching out to the communities and communicating. And certainly when generative AI, sort of hit the scene, they said, whoa, wait a minute. We have to see, are we introducing the right things within the legislation that is
Hmm.
going to actually still be relevant for these types of scenarios? And so that's been really interesting. You can see like the speed at which a regulatory body can work is happening.
Yeah.
And, other regions are taking note. You have the US working with
Hmm.
the EU to figure out how to coincide our strategy here, and our frameworks here with what they're doing so that we're able to have easy
Hmm.
commerce
Hmm.
between us and our businesses can operate effectively across the pond. And then you have out in Asia Pacific places like Australia also taking reference on what is the EU doing and what is the US doing. So just watching some of the media conversations and from like the major
Hmm.
government bodies, whether that's the White House or the EU or Australia or anywhere that you live in the world, it will help you keep up on what's going on in the bigger brushstrokes. Now, it gets a little bit more interesting because certainly within the US, there are 17 states right now that have at least one regulation that has been enacted or is in committee and getting ready to be activated.
Hmm.
And that becomes a little trickier. And so I think, certainly I've got a link and I go in and I'm like, okay, well, what happened today? But it's very, very manual. But there are tools that legal teams have where they're watching for these types of legislation and where it is from introduction through committee to becoming law. And it's really important to work with your legal teams and make it core to your AI governance process because that's the one rail you can't hit. It's like that's where your fines are going to come in.
Yeah.
And certainly because of the granularity of regions,
Sure.
New York City has its own set of rules around use of AI and generative AI. So it's like you have to kind of stay with that. And even within the EU, you're going to find countries and municipalities probably introducing their own legislations as well. So it's those, really rely on your legal teams to help you in those areas. And then ultimately, there are category classes within those regulations. Is it, AI will do no harm, which is basically around decisioning, for example, or malicious content.
Okay.
There's things like privacy. There are security concerns. There's IP and copyright protection, things of that nature. So these categories are ways that governance teams can understand and organize like regulations, regardless of where they come out from the world, and then be able to align the appropriate actors within the organization to stay on top of that and be effective in use cases that might
Hmm.
be related or could potentially or need to be compliant with those particular regulations. So this balance, it's like the AI governance team is helping to gain an understanding of what's out there, working with the legal teams, and then figuring out how to bring that down into a business operation that is effective.
Let's say we have no AI governance posture at all right now. Let's say that's the organization, right?
Yep.
To begin an AI governance program, are you basically saying follow all of the current best practices, data governance best practices, regulations, laws, etc., for privacy, security, etc., and call the lawyers when you need help? are you are, are you
Maybe not
basically
quite that
saying
simple.
how should we really get started? I don't want to trivialize this, right? So, how should we really get started building an AI governance program if we don't already have one?
Yeah. So the first thing is yes, you need to build on what you have.
Okay.
You have standard operating procedures for GRC, governance, risk, and
Yeah.
compliance. That's going to be your overall framework for the company. You have data governance, you have data security, you have privacy, chief privacy officers overseeing that. You have teams that are looking at lifecycle management and overall data protection. So use those frameworks. Those feed into everything from an AI governance perspective, but they are also very similar frameworks, even across all those governance bodies. So now what you're able to do is kind of lift that up and take a look at, well, what does this mean for my data science organization? And in fact, at many companies that I've spoken with, that's exactly what they're doing. They say, how do we govern today in all of these different areas? Data governance is going to be a starting point for AI governance because it's a data-driven competency. And data governance teams are being expanded to now take on the nuances that come into how to develop a trustworthy
Right.
model. And so that's the simplest way to get started. And then the other side of it is there are new frameworks that are out there. The OECD has an AI framework that was designed to support the EU Act, the EU AI Act. And then you have NIST, who's developed a lot of our security frameworks and risk management frameworks. They have an AI risk management framework. And that also gives you an understanding of how to assure
Uh-huh.
that your AI is responsible, trustworthy, and effective. So you can get started very quickly with what you have and what you know. And then I will still say, because of the fast and furious nature and the heightened awareness of, oh no, AI is going to take over the world and make us all obsolete, there are regulations that are coming
Yeah.
down. So to be frank,
Yeah.
the legal teams are getting in much earlier on these discussions, but that's not too unlike what you saw in, the financial industry when you had the Basel II coming down. And in fact, that's a really good model for AI governance now that we have generative AI. That's some very standard practices and frameworks that you can use because one was moving from standard
Yeah.
models to custom models. What are we talking about here? So that's another sort of legal perspective that you can take a look at to reference. We've been here.
Right, exactly. And in so many ways, right? This is just a different topic, right?
Yeah.
But the need for that is ever present, right? Well, we've been talking a lot about some of these defensive measures, right? Let's
Yeah.
get into what are you most excited about from an opportunity standpoint in this space now with generative AI? What gets you fired up?
At heart, I'm a data chick.
Okay.
And and I think what's fabulous is that we are not constrained to a single domain. We are able to now process multiple domains together. Now, why does that become interesting? Well, let's take a healthcare scenario. If you want to look at the entire set of patterns that occur from when somebody might suffer,
Uh-huh.
a life event that takes them in an ambulance, that brings them to the hospital, that moves them to rehab, that then brings them home, is working with their doctors, and then something bad happens and they cycle back through it somewhere. I mean, there are real patterns in quality of care in healthcare. And I think where AI and certainly generative AI are going to really help us is that when we talk about data domains, those are all separate data domains. How do you stitch those together and look holistically at healthcare and the outcomes from those practices, whether it's the way that the doctor is helping with a care plan, to the drugs that are being taken, to maybe some rehab that's being done, to the patient's
Yeah.
behavior themselves. And so that begins to start this new opportunity where we are using AI not in these pinpoints, but really stitching together not only our own business silos, but our partnerships and the ecosystems that we live in. And that's where I really think the potential comes from, because when you can do that, you can really change the
That's
world.
really, really cool. And that's just one subject area, right? I mean, there's an
Right.
infinite number of those because you're talking about stitching together infinite numbers of domains, right? So that's the possibilities are endless. That's really cool.
Yeah.
What is this going to do to careers, right? There's worry out there about some obsolescence for certain types of careers. But what I just heard you say is this may open up all sorts of doors for brand new careers in a lot of different spaces. What are your thoughts on that? Where are we headed in that aspect of the future?
Well, I think one side of it is, yes, there are going to be some jobs that you just don't have to do anymore. When I got out of school, I was like, typing out, policies on triplicates, and I was like, why can't we just put this into a computer? Well, then that was data entry, but we don't do that anymore, I mean,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
to
yeah.
that extent. So yeah, there's going to be an evolution in terms of jobs that go away, but in some ways, the role that I had, in college of
Hmm.
typing out policies still need to be created at insurance companies. And so there's always going to be a role within an organization that has that responsibility. How that gets executed is going to be very different with an AI capability that sits alongside and augments that particular role. So I think that's what we're going to see a lot more of. It's sort of augmenting these roles,
Hmm. Hmm.
scaling those roles out, handling some of the issues of we don't have enough workers to fill the jobs that we've got, and then starting to automate those things that it's like, nobody liked getting up and going to work to do that particular task. So, a machine's just going to take it over, which is kind of the same thing. So
Yep.
there's
Yep.
sort of this technical paradigm that we've always gone through that I think is still going to continue.
Sure.
But the other side of it is skill sets. The critical thinking process that we go through is going to have to be further developed.
Okay.
Going back to that information dissemination that we talked about earlier, machines have been learning from us. We don't want to allow machines only to learn from machines. You got to keep us in the middle. One,
Yeah.
because your business becomes amazingly boring. I mean, I love my iPad, but it's only cool because I use it. So it's really the creative spark that we have within us as humans in terms of our aspirations. Yes, generative AI or AI capabilities can introduce something that helps take it to the next level, but I think we're going to find that we have, as employees and users of AI, even in our own lives, we're going to be able to do things that we weren't able to do before. So I don't think, it's going to have some disruption. This is not a cakewalk. And it's going to be hard for some people to change, but I don't see this as fully taking over the world, at least not
At
yet.
least not yet. And plus,
Yeah.
there will be roles for preventing companies from becoming boring. Don't be boring,
Exactly.
chief.
I
Don't be
mean, I
boring
think what it
officer.
really, yeah, please don't be boring. Yeah. But, on the flip side, I think the thing to take away for enterprises and the C-suite is we're going to have a real product safety issue with generative AI. You produce it, you use it, it creates an issue with your customers and society, and it's going to come back to bite you. And we have product safety
Hmm.
constraints
That's
already
right.
on the books.
Sure.
We cannot abdicate responsible use of AI because there isn't a regulation out there.
Right.
And so, when you hear people signing these letters of, stop all work on AI, or the world's going to be overturned in, 5 to 10 years, there was some survey out recently. I get that. And those are things that we need to be concerned about. But those same people that are saying it have essentially abdicated their responsibility of what they built and are delivering to market.
Right.
We only get to a bad place when organizations don't acknowledge their role in taking us to that bad place.
Michelle shared how generative AI, like a fairy godmother, can break down those. This is so stupid. Oh. Michelle shared how generative AI, like a fairy godmother, can break down those pesky data silos and combine information across realms, including our favorite mythical land, healthcare. But with great power comes great responsibility. That's where AI governance swoops in like a superhero, ensuring data quality, trust, privacy, security, and lifecycle management stay in check. Wrapping up this roller coaster of a conversation, we put on our safety goggles and reflected on the significance of product safety and ethical AI use. It's up to us to keep AI in line and ensure it remains a force for good rather than an Orwellian nightmare. So here's to striking that perfect balance between innovative breakthroughs, responsible AI deployment, and having a good chuckle along the way. All right, I got to stop everybody right there. I got to have to come clean with you now. I used AI, I used generative AI myself to write the conclusion notes, both in the previous part 1 episode. They're not bad, right? I gave it some prompts and then set up the robot to know that it was a podcast, right? It was a podcast host writing transcript summaries. Pretty good job. For this one, I kind of had to ask, can you add a little humor to this conclusion? I couldn't let it stand with being a boring robot. Michelle said, don't be boring. So, well, the name of the game here is that there's massive innovation potential with AI these days, right? But just as much risk if we're not carefully governing the use of this powerful technology. The input data being used, the models themselves, right? And the data then being created by AI, all of this demands review for ethical and legal purposes, as well as quality and accuracy and humor too. Fundamentals matter. And with that, the sky's the limit. For Calibra, this is the Data Download. I'm your host, Jay Millicher, at least until the robots get to me. I'll see you next time.